The morning mist clung to the Kansas prairie like a held breath, silver threads weaving through the tall grass that stretched beyond sight. Thomas Brennan guided his horse along the fence line, checking for breaks in the wire when he saw her, a small figure moving through the sea of amber grass like a ghost made flesh. She couldn't have been more than 7, her dark hair tangled with burrs and morning dew, feet bare and cut from the rough ground. Her dress, once blue, was torn and faded to the color of old sky. She walked with purpose, as if she knew exactly where she was going, though there was nothing but empty prairie for miles in every direction. "Hey there, little one." Thomas dismounted slowly, his voice gentle, as he approached a wounded animal. The child stopped but didn't look at him, her gaze fixed on some distant point only she could see. "Where are you going, sweetheart? Where's your mama?" At the word mama, something flickered in her eyes, a spark of recognition, of pain. Her lips moved, barely a whisper carried on the wind. "Mama told me to wait." Thomas felt something twist in his chest. He'd been finding lost cattle for 30 years, but never a lost child. Never something so fragile, standing in the middle of nowhere with secrets heavy in her small hands. "Well, then," he said softly, shrugging off his jacket, "maybe you should wait somewhere safe." The child didn't resist when he wrapped the worn leather around her shoulders, though she didn't help either. She was like a bird with a broken wing, alive but unreachable. The ride back to the house was silent except for the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and the whisper of wind through grass. The child sat in front of him, still as carved wood, her eyes scanning the horizon, as if searching for something that would never come. Margaret was hanging laundry when they approached, her hands pausing mid-motion, as she saw the small figure in Thomas's arms. 25 years of marriage had taught her to read her husband's face, and what she saw there, gentleness mixed with something like grief, made her heart skip. "Found her out on the north pasture," Thomas said as he dismounted, lifting the child down with careful hands, walking like she had somewhere to be. Margaret knelt to the child's level, taking in the scratches on her feet, the exhaustion in her posture. "What's your name, honey?" The same response, spoken like a prayer or a mantra. "Mama told me to wait." Margaret and Thomas exchanged a look over the child's head. They'd been trying for children for 15 years before the doctor's words had finally made them stop hoping. Now here was this small mystery, delivered by the prairie wind like an answer to a prayer they'd stopped saying. "Well," Margaret said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands, "you can wait here if you'd like. We've got clean water and warm soup." The child looked at her then, really looked, and Margaret saw something in those dark eyes that made her want to wrap this little stranger in her arms and never let go. But she'd learned patience from years of disappointment, learned that some things couldn't be rushed. "Come on," she said instead, standing and extending her hand. "Let's get those feet cleaned up." As they walked toward the house, Margaret noticed the child's head turning back toward the prairie, as if she were memorizing the landscape, mapping her way back to wherever she'd come from. The thought made Margaret's chest tight, but she pushed it away. For now, this small girl was here, safe, and that would have to be enough. The kitchen smelled of fresh bread and coffee, normal scents that seemed strange with this otherworldly child sitting at the wooden table. Margaret filled a basin with warm water and soap, kneeling to tend the cuts on small feet that had walked too far, too long. These might sting a little, she warned, but the child didn't flinch, didn't make a sound. She just stared out the window at the endless grass, lips moving silently around words only she could hear. Thomas stood in the doorway, his hat in his hands, watching his wife's gentle ministrations. They talked about adoption once years ago, but the silence that followed had been answer enough. Now here was this child who'd appeared from nowhere, and Thomas found himself wondering if some prayers took longer to answer than others. "Sheriff'll want to know," he said quietly. Margaret's hand stilled. "Tomorrow. Tonight, she needs rest." The child's eyes moved between them, understanding more than she revealed. When Margaret offered her a bowl of soup, she accepted it but only picked at the broth, as if eating too much might make her forget something important. As evening settled over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Margaret made up the small bed in what would have been the nursery. The child stood in the doorway, still wrapped in Thomas's jacket, watching the careful preparation. "Mama told me to wait," she said again, and this time it sounded less like an explanation and more like a question. "I know, sweetheart," Margaret replied, smoothing the quilt her own mother had made. "Sometimes waiting is the hardest thing of all." That night, as the wind sang through the grass outside, the child lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Down the hall, Thomas and Margaret whispered in their bed, their voices carrying the weight of decisions unmade and hearts carefully guarded. But in the small room that smelled of lavender and hope, a little girl clutched the memory of her mother's last words like a lifeline, trusting that somewhere in this vast, empty place, love could still be found. 3 days passed like held breath. The child, who still wouldn't say her name, moved through the house like morning mist, present but not quite there. She ate when food was placed before her, slept when darkness fell, but always with that distant look, as if part of her remained out on the prairie, still waiting. Margaret found herself making excuses to stay near. She'd reorganized the pantry, while the child sat at the kitchen table, or mend shirts in the living room where she could watch the small figure standing at the window. There was something hypnotic about the child's stillness, the way she seemed to be listening to sounds no one else could hear. On the 4th morning, Margaret was kneading bread when she heard it, a soft humming, barely audible. The child sat at the table, turning an empty teacup in her hands, and from her lips came a melody both haunting and familiar, an old lullaby, Margaret realized, one her own mother used to sing. "That's a pretty song," Margaret said, not stopping her work, afraid that too much attention might break the spell. The humming stopped. "Mama sang it." It was the first words beyond her refrain that the child had spoken. Margaret's hands stilled in the dough, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Did she sing it at bedtime?" A small nod. "When the wind was loud." She said music was stronger than storms. Margaret turned then, flour dusting her hands, and saw the child looking directly at her for the first time. In those dark eyes was an intelligence that seemed too old, too knowing for such a small face. "Your mama sounds like she was very wise. She said wise women know when to hold on and when to let go." The child's fingers traced the rim of the teacup, but she never said which was which. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning neither of them was ready to unpack. Margaret returned to her kneading, letting the rhythm of her hands speak when words felt too dangerous. That afternoon, Thomas came in from the fields to find the child standing in his workshop, staring at the wooden toys he'd carved years ago and never had the heart to throw away. A rocking horse, worn smooth from handling. A set of blocks with letters carved deep into the wood. A small dollhouse, complete down to tiny furniture he'd crafted during the long evenings when hope still felt possible. "You made these," the child said. It wasn't a question. Thomas nodded, suddenly self-conscious about these relics of dreams he'd thought buried. "Long time ago." The child reached out to touch the rocking horse, her small fingers tracing the smooth mane. "Mama said broken things could be beautiful if someone loved them enough to keep the pieces. Something cracked open in Thomas's chest. He knelt beside her, his weathered hands gentle on the wooden toy. This isn't broken, just waiting for the right person to ride it. Like me? The simplicity of the question nearly undid him. Maybe so. That evening, Sheriff Patterson finally came by, his badge catching the lamplight as he sat at their kitchen table. A kind man, with eyes that had seen too much of what people could do to each other. "State's got people looking for her family," he said, his voice low while the child sat in the living room, carefully arranging the wooden blocks. "Missing persons reports. Abandoned vehicles. Nothing yet, but..." He shrugged, the gesture carrying the weight of too many cases that ended badly. "How long?" Margaret asked. "These things take time. Could be weeks. Could be months. Could be never." He looked toward the living room where the soft sound of blocks clicking against each other provided a strange sort of music. She's got to have come from somewhere, though. People don't just appear from thin air. But even as he said it, Sheriff Patterson felt the inadequacy of the words. Because looking at this child with her two old eyes and her careful way of moving through the world, it was easy to believe in miraculous appearances, in children born from prairie wind and starlight. After the sheriff left, Margaret found the child standing at her bedroom window, looking out at the darkness where the prairie stretched endlessly. "Are you afraid?" Margaret asked softly. The child considered this with the seriousness of someone much older. "Mama said fear was just love with nowhere to go." "And what do you love?" The sound of her voice, the way she smelled like lavender and rain, the stories she told about brave girls who found their way home. The child's breath fogged the glass. "But I don't know where home is anymore." Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. She wanted to tell this small girl that home could be here, that love didn't require blood or legal documents, that sometimes the most beautiful families were the ones built from pieces of broken hearts. But instead, she simply stood beside her, both of them looking out at the vast darkness. "Maybe home isn't a place," Margaret said finally. "Maybe it's wherever someone is waiting for you with love." The child turned then, studying Margaret's face in the dim light. "Is that what you're doing? Waiting with love?" The question was so direct, so hopeful, that Margaret felt something shift inside her chest, like a key turning in a long locked door. "Yes," she whispered. "I think I am." That night, for the first time since her arrival, the child didn't wake screaming from dreams of endless grass and calling voices. Instead, she slept deeply, curled up in the small bed with Thomas's jacket pulled close, while down the hall, Margaret and Thomas lay awake making plans they were afraid to speak aloud. Outside, the prairie wind sang its ancient song, carrying the scent of coming winter and the promise that some stories, the best ones, were just beginning. 2 weeks into October, the child told them her name was Sarah. It happened at breakfast over pancakes and honey, as naturally as sunrise. Margaret had been pouring coffee when the small voice said, "Sarah Elizabeth Morrison. Mama said never to forget your whole name, because names are how people find you when you're lost." Margaret set the coffee pot down with trembling hands. Thomas looked up from his eggs, hope and fear warring in his expression. "That's a beautiful name," Margaret managed. "Sarah Elizabeth." But even as they celebrated this small breakthrough, Sheriff Patterson's words echoed in their minds. A name meant records, meant someone, somewhere, was looking for this child. It meant their borrowed time might be running out. The weather turned that afternoon, dark clouds rolling across the prairie like an omen. Sarah stood at the kitchen window watching the storm build with an intensity that made Margaret's skin prickle. Big storms scared Mama, Sarah said quietly. She'd hold me tight and count between the thunder and lightning. Said if you could count to 10, the storm was moving away. As if summoned by her words, lightning split the sky. Sarah began counting, her small voice steady, despite the tremor in her hands. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi. Thunder crashed at 7, rattling the windows. Sarah's counting stopped. It's coming closer, she whispered. The storm hit with a fury that seemed personal. Rain lashed against the house, and wind howled through the eaves like something alive and angry. The power flickered once, twice, then died, leaving them in the dancing shadows of candlelight. Sarah had gone very still, pressed against the window despite the chaos outside. Margaret approached carefully, recognizing the signs of a child lost in memory. Sarah? Sweetheart, what is it? The last storm, Sarah said, her voice hollow. Mama said to wait in the cellar, said she'd come back for me. But she never. Her breath fogged the glass. I waited so long, and then I couldn't wait anymore. The pieces fell into place with horrible clarity. A storm cellar. A mother who never returned. A child who finally emerged to find only empty land and endless sky. Margaret knelt beside Sarah, not touching, but close enough to catch her if she fell. Where was this cellar, honey? By the old farmhouse, with the blue shutters and the broken porch. Sarah's tears finally came, silent streams down her cheeks. I looked and looked, but the house was empty. Just me and the wind and Mama's voice telling me to wait. Thomas appeared in the doorway, having heard enough to understand. His face was pale in the candlelight, his hands clenched at his sides. How long were you in that cellar, Sarah? Days and days, until I got so hungry I couldn't think. Then I heard her voice on the wind, telling me to find people who would love me while she couldn't. Sarah turned from the window, her small face streaked with tears. But what if she comes back and I'm not there? What if she's waiting for me now? The question hung in the air like a blade. Margaret felt her heart breaking for this child who'd been taught that love meant waiting, even when waiting meant being alone and afraid. Oh, sweetheart, Margaret whispered, finally reaching out to gather Sarah into her arms. Your mama wouldn't want you to wait in an empty place. She'd want you to be safe and warm and loved. But I promised I'd wait. And you did. You waited as long as you could. But sometimes, Margaret's voice caught. Sometimes the bravest thing is knowing when to stop waiting and start living. Outside the storm raged on, but inside the circle of candlelight, 3 people held each other against the darkness. Thomas joined them on the floor, his big hands gentle on Sarah's small shoulders. We know about the farmhouse, he said quietly. Old Henderson Place, been empty for years. We'll take you there tomorrow if you want, so you can see. Sarah nodded against Margaret's shoulder, her sobs finally subsiding into hiccups. Will you come with me? Every step, Margaret promised. We won't leave you alone. The storm blew itself out before dawn, leaving the world washed clean and gleaming. Sarah woke with red eyes but steady hands, as if the tears had carried away something heavy she'd been carrying. They drove to the Henderson place in Thomas's truck. The 3 of them crowded into the front seat. Sarah sat between them, small and serious, preparing herself for whatever she might find. The farmhouse stood like a broken tooth against the sky, its blue shutters faded to gray, the porch sagging under the weight of neglect. Behind it, barely visible in the tall grass, was the storm cellar, a concrete rectangle with heavy wooden doors. Sarah walked to it slowly, her steps measured and careful. The doors hung open now, revealing nothing but darkness and the musty smell of abandonment. No sign of recent habitation. No indication that anyone had been looking for a lost little girl. "She's not here," Sarah said simply. Margaret knelt beside her, aching for the finality in that young voice. "No, honey, she's not. She's not coming back, is she?" The question demanded honesty, even when honesty was cruel. "I don't think so, sweetheart." Sarah nodded, her composure remarkable for someone so young. She walked to the edge of the cellar and looked down into the darkness where she'd waited, trusting and afraid. "Goodbye, Mama," she whispered. "I love you, and I won't wait anymore." As they drove home, Sarah sat quietly between Margaret and Thomas, her small hand finding Margaret's and holding tight. The prairie stretched around them, no longer empty, but full of possibility. "What happens now?" Sarah asked. Margaret looked at Thomas, seeing her own hope reflected in his eyes. "Now we go home, and we figure out what comes next. Together." For the first time since they'd found her, Sarah smiled. A real smile, small but genuine. Together sounds nice. Behind them, the abandoned farmhouse grew smaller in the rearview mirror until it disappeared entirely, swallowed by the endless grass. But ahead, the road stretched on, leading them toward a future none of them had planned, but all of them were ready to embrace. November brought the first snow, soft flakes that transformed the prairie into a wonderland of white silence. Sarah pressed her face to the kitchen window, watching the world disappear under winter's gentle blanket. "It's beautiful," she breathed, her breath fogging the glass. Margaret smiled, stirring soup on the stove. In the month since their trip to the farmhouse, something had shifted in all of them. The desperate edge of waiting had softened into something more sustainable, a quiet contentment that grew stronger each day. Sarah had begun to laugh, real laughter, bright and infectious, that filled the house with music. She helped Margaret in the kitchen, learning to knead bread and stir soup. She followed Thomas to the barn, her small hands eager to help with chores. She'd claimed the wooden toys as her own, and the rocking horse now lived in the corner of her room, its painted eyes watching over her sleep. Sheriff Patterson had visited twice more, each time with the same report. No missing person reports matched Sarah's description, no abandoned vehicles found, no leads to follow. It was as if she'd appeared from nowhere, a gift from the prairie itself. "The state social worker wants to meet with you folks," he'd said the last time, "about making things official." The word had hung in the air like a promise. Official, legal, permanent. Now, watching Sarah trace patterns in the window frost, Margaret felt the fierce protectiveness that had grown in her chest like a second heartbeat. This child was theirs now, in every way that mattered. The paperwork would just make it real for the rest of the world. "Margaret?" Sarah's voice was small, uncertain. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course, sweetheart. If I stay here, if this becomes my home, does that mean I'm forgetting Mama?" Margaret set down her spoon and knelt beside Sarah, taking her small hands in her own. This question had been coming for weeks, she knew. The guilt that lived in children's hearts when they dared to be happy after loss. "Oh, honey, loving new people doesn't mean you forget the ones who came before. Your Mama will always be part of you. Her songs, her stories, the way she taught you to be brave. That's yours forever." Sarah nodded slowly, working through the complex arithmetic of love and loyalty. She wanted me to find people who would love me. She said so in the storm. "Then maybe," Margaret said gently, "the best way to honor her is to let yourself be loved." That afternoon, Thomas taught Sarah to build a snowman in the front yard. They rolled snowballs until they were red-faced and laughing, working together to lift the heavy head into place. Sarah found stones for eyes and a carrot for the nose, while Thomas wrapped his old scarf around the snowman's neck. "He needs a name," Sarah declared, stepping back to admire their work. "What do you think?" Thomas asked. Sarah considered seriously. "Sam. Like, Sarah and Margaret and Thomas all mixed up." Thomas felt his chest tighten with something too big for words. "Sam it is." They stood together in the snow, three people who'd found each other in the vast emptiness of the prairie. The snowman stood sentinel beside them, a guardian built from winter and hope. That evening, as Sarah sat at the kitchen table working on letters Thomas had been teaching her, Margaret watched her with quiet amazement. The child, who'd appeared like a ghost from the grass, had become solid, real, permanent. Her laughter filled the corners of the house. Her small clothes hung on the line beside theirs. Her book sat on the shelf next to Margaret's novels. "I wrote something," Sarah announced, holding up a piece of paper covered in careful letters. Margaret read aloud. "My name is Sarah Elizabeth Morrison Brennan. I live on a farm with Margaret and Thomas, who love me. I am not waiting anymore. I am home." The hyphenated name made Margaret's vision blur. Morrison Brennan. Past and present joined together, creating something new. "That's beautiful, sweetheart," Margaret managed. "I want to send it to Mama," Sarah said. Thomas said letters can go anywhere, if you believe hard enough. They held a ceremony that night, the three of them standing in the snow under a sky bright with stars. Sarah had written her letter on special paper, decorated with drawings of the farm, the snowman, and three stick figures holding hands. "Dear Mama," she read by flashlight, "I found them. The people you told me to look for. They love me very much, and I love them too. I'm not waiting anymore, but I'm not forgetting either. Thank you for teaching me to be brave. Love. Sarah Elizabeth Morrison Brennan." She folded the letter carefully and placed it in a small box Thomas had made. They buried it beneath the oak tree by the house, marking the spot with stones arranged in a heart. "There," Sarah said, brushing snow from her mittens. "Now she knows I'm okay." As they walked back to the house, warm light spilling from the windows onto the snow, Margaret felt the last piece of her guarded heart click into place. This child, this gift from the prairie, had made them a family in ways they'd never imagined possible. Later, after Sarah was asleep, Margaret and Thomas sat by the fire, watching the flames dance in the grate. The adoption papers lay on the coffee table between them, waiting to be signed. "Are you ready for this?" Thomas asked. Margaret thought of the little girl upstairs, sleeping peacefully under quilts that had waited years for small hands to pull them close. She thought of morning laughter and bedtime stories, of scraped knees to kiss and homework to help with, of all the ordinary miracles that made a family. "I've been ready my whole life," she said. "I just didn't know it until she walked out of that grass." Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the prairie in pristine white. Somewhere beneath the oak tree, a letter rested in its wooden box, carrying love across the impossible distance between memory and hope. And in the small bedroom under the eaves, Sarah Elizabeth Morrison Brennan slept deeply, dreaming not of endless waiting but of home. This place where love had found her at last, where she was chosen and cherished and would never have to wait alone again. The prairie wind sang its eternal song, but now it carried new music, the sound of a family complete, of love that had grown from loss, of a little girl who'd learned that sometimes the end of waiting was just the beginning of something beautiful. Spring would come again, as it always did, bringing new grass and wildflowers. But for now, winter held them safe in its quiet embrace, three hearts beating in rhythm, home at last.